Ethan Walker grabbed the old man's wrist, not gently, and pulled him back from the edge of that truck bed before the crate crushed him flat. The old man stared at him like he'd seen a ghost. Ethan just stared back, breathing hard, hands still shaking. Neither of them said a word for a full 5 seconds. And that one moment, that single instinctive grab, set off a chain of events that would completely destroy the quiet, lonely life Ethan had spent 3 years carefully building around himself. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You're going to want to stay for all 5 parts of this one. The day started like every other day Ethan Walker had lived through in the past 3 years. Which meant it started with pain he didn't talk about. 4:47 a.m. The alarm hit. He was already awake, had been since 3, lying flat on his back in the dark, staring at a ceiling that never gave him any answers. He reached over and silenced the alarm before it could wake Noah down the hall, then sat up slowly, put both feet on the cold floor, and just sat there for a minute. Just sat there. That was the part nobody saw. The 60 seconds every morning where Ethan Walker sat on the edge of his bed and reminded himself out loud, sometimes in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had a reason to stand up. Noah. That was the whole list. One name. One reason. Every single morning. He stood up. By 5:15 he had coffee going and Noah's lunch half made. By 5:30 he was in the shower. By 6 o'clock, he was leaning against the kitchen counter, watching Noah shuffle in, wearing dinosaur socks that didn't match, hair pointing in 4 different directions, rubbing his eyes like the morning had personally offended him. 8 years old. The spitting image of his mother around the eyes. Ethan felt that familiar tightening in his chest and looked down at his coffee mug. "You eat that cereal," Ethan said. "Don't just move it around with the spoon." "I'm eating it," Noah said, which was exactly what he always said when he was absolutely not eating it. "I can see the spoon moving in circles, bud." "Circles is eating." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. He poured himself a second cup he didn't need and checked his phone. 3 messages from the shop already. Mike's alignment machine was acting up again. There was a fleet truck coming in from Henderson Logistics that nobody had scheduled, and Danny had called in sick, which meant Ethan was going to be short-handed on what was already stacking up to be a 12-hour day. He typed back, "On my way. Give me 45. He looked at Noah. "Finish the cereal. Real eating, not circles." Tug. The auto shop sat at the edge of town on Route 41, a squat gray building with 3 bays and a gravel lot that needed repaving about 6 years ago. Ethan had worked there for 11 years. He knew every tool, every creaking shelf, every temperamental hydraulic lift. He knew the sound the building made when it rained, and the smell of the break room coffee that no amount of cleaning had ever fully fixed. He was good at his job, better than good. But that morning, standing under a Henderson Logistics truck with a wrench in his hand and engine grease on his forearm before 8 a.m., Ethan felt the particular kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. It wasn't physical tired. It was the tired of carrying something heavy for a very long time with no end in sight. "You good?" That was Marcus, his coworker, poking his head under the truck with the concerned face he'd been making at Ethan for approximately 3 years running. "Fine," Ethan said. "You look like..." "I'm fine, Marcus." Marcus held up both hands and backed away. He'd learned when to push and when not to. This was a not today, and he could read it. Ethan went back to the truck. He finished his shift at 5:30, which was 40 minutes later than he'd told Noah's after-school sitter he'd be back. He texted her an apology, and a little extra in the Venmo. She was good about it. She'd been good about a lot of things over the past 3 years, and Ethan knew he owed more gratitude than he ever properly expressed. He climbed into his truck, a 2018 F-150 that had seen better years but still ran well, because Ethan maintained it himself, and pulled out of the shop lot onto Route 41 heading north. The radio came on automatically. Some country station. He turned it off. He drove in silence. That was the other part nobody talked about. The drive home. 15 minutes door to door. For 3 years, those 15 minutes had been the one part of the day where nobody needed anything from him, where he didn't have to hold any particular expression on his face, where he could just be. Be whatever he actually was underneath all the functioning, which on most days felt like something held together with electrical tape and routine. He passed the Sunoco station, the Methodist church, the blinking yellow light at Carver Road that the county had promised to fix since 2021. And then he almost passed the old farmhouse on Millbrook Pike. Almost. He saw the truck first, an old Chevy. C10 mid-70s, he clocked it immediately. Faded red paint, one taillight, held on with what looked like a bungee cord parked on the gravel shoulder in front of a white farmhouse that had clearly been sitting empty for a while. The grass was high. The porch railing was missing 2 boards. But somebody had recently cleared the driveway, and somebody had recently delivered a load of wooden crates and equipment that was now piled beside that old Chevy waiting to be loaded. The somebody trying to load it was a man who had no business trying to do it alone. Ethan saw him and immediately saw the problem. The man was old 70s at least, and thin in the way men get when they've lost weight they weren't trying to lose. He had both arms wrapped around a wooden crate that was clearly at least 60-65 pounds, and he was attempting to get it up and over the truck bed wall by sheer determination, because determination was the only resource he had enough of. His hands were shaking, not with effort, or not only with effort, with something else. Age maybe, or grief, or just the particular tremor of a man whose body had started filing complaints that his mind refused to acknowledge. Ethan's foot came off the gas. He didn't make a conscious decision. His body decided before his brain signed off on it. He pulled over. "Dad." The man didn't notice him right away. He was too focused on the crate jaw set, arms locked, trying to will it into the truck by force of stubbornness. Ethan climbed out and crossed the gravel and reached him just as the man shifted his grip, and the crate tilted and Ethan's hand shot out and grabbed the man's wrist in the crate at the same time, steadying both before either one went anywhere bad. The old man stumbled back a step. He stared at Ethan. Ethan stared back, still holding the crate, breathing a little harder than he expected from just crossing a parking lot. They stood like that for a 5 count. Just 2 strangers looking at each other on a gravel shoulder in rural Tennessee with a 60-pound crate between them. "Son," the old man said finally, his voice gravel and tobacco and something warmer underneath. "I was handling that." "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "I could see that." The old man's eyes narrowed. Then slowly the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "Well," he said, "since you're already holding it, where do you want it?" "Back of the truck. Far side if you don't mind. Heavier stuff anchors better toward the cab." Ethan loaded the crate. The old man's name was Walter Bennett. He offered it the same way he seemed to do most things, directly without a lot of ceremony. Stuck out a weathered hand with thick carpenter's fingers and said, "Walter Bennett. Lived in this county 68 of my 72 years. Ethan Walker." Ethan shook it. "I've driven past this property about 1,000 times. Hasn't looked like much for a while." Walter said, glancing at the farmhouse. "Used to. My father built it in 1959. I grew up here." He paused. "Margaret, my wife, she always wanted to restore it. Bring it back to what it was." He stopped again. Looked at the house. "She passed in February." 2 words hit Ethan in the sternum. She passed. He knew that sentence. He knew exactly what it weighed. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it in the way that only people who have actually said it about their own loss can mean it. Not politely. Actually. Walter looked at him sideways. "You know what that's like," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 years ago," Ethan said. "My wife. We had an 8-year-old. Walter was quiet for a moment. "Then you know it doesn't get smaller," he said. "You just get wider." Ethan looked at him. He'd heard 100 things about grief in 3 years. Platitudes. Bible verses, well-meaning casseroles with handwritten notes. Nobody had ever said it quite like that. You just get wider. Yeah, Ethan said. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. They loaded the rest together. It took 40 minutes. There were 6 more crates, a canvas-wrapped bundle that turned out to be antique woodworking tools, hand planes and chisels, and a brace and bit set that made Walter's voice go quiet and fond when he talked about them. 2 wooden sawhorses, a crated cast-iron wood stove, and a collection of lumber pieces that Walter explained were original boards he'd salvaged from the sections of the house that had been most damaged. I'm going to restore it the way she would have wanted, Walter said, setting a sawhorse into the truck bed. Not quickly, correctly. What kind of condition is the structure? Ethan asked. Walter glanced at him. You know construction. I know enough. And I know what happens to old farmhouses when they sit empty in Tennessee humidity for 10 years. Walter laughed a real laugh, short and rough, surprised out of him. Subflooring in the east wing is shot, he said. Porch needs to come down and go back up. Roof over the kitchen was patched badly probably 15 years ago, and the patch is now the problem. Windows throughout need resealing or replacing. He ticked them off like a list he'd been carrying in his head for a long time. It's a lot for one man. Do you have help? Walter shrugged. I have opinions, and I have stubbornness. Those are the 2 things I've always had in surplus. Ethan found himself smiling a real one, which surprised him. Those'll take you pretty far on a construction project. They take you most of the way, Walter agreed. The rest you need actual help for. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the house. He told himself he was just going to help load a truck and go home. They ended up standing next to the tailgate for another 20 minutes. Walter asked about Noah and Ethan answered more than he usually did when people asked which he couldn't fully explain, except that something about Walter made the questions feel like genuine curiosity rather than social obligation. What's he like? Walter asked. Smart, Ethan said. Smarter than I was at his age by a lot. Emotional, he feels things hard and deep, which I'm grateful for, even when it makes the hard days harder. He paused. He misses his mom. He doesn't always have the words for it, but I can see it. Mostly he keeps going. He's better at that than I am, honestly. Kids are, Walter said. They don't have enough past to look backward at. They just keep moving forward, because that's the only direction they know. Ethan was quiet. What about you? Walter said. You keeping going? I am. That's not what I asked. Ethan looked at him. Walter was watching him with eyes that had clearly done a lifetime of reading people. Not unkindly, just honestly. Some days are better than others, Ethan said carefully. That's true for every human being on Earth, Walter said. I'm asking about you specifically. Ethan exhaled through his nose. I go to work. I raise my son. I try to do both well. He paused. I don't know if that's keeping going or if that's just existing. Some nights I can't tell the difference. Walter nodded slowly. Like that was an honest answer, and he respected it. Margaret used to say that surviving and living look almost identical from the outside, he said. The difference is whether something still surprises you. He looked at Ethan. When's the last time something surprised you? Ethan thought about it, really thought about it. I can't remember, he said. Walter nodded again, and then like he'd made some kind of private decision, he said, I could use a second opinion on that subflooring, and probably a strong back for a Saturday. He looked at Ethan sideways. You do anything this weekend? Ethan opened his mouth to say no, to list all the reasons. Noah's soccer, the yard, the 3 loads of laundry he'd been ignoring since Tuesday. I'll have my son with me, he said instead. Farmhouses are good for kids, Walter said simply. Lots of space, lots to explore. I've got a decent back porch and 0 judgment. Ethan looked at the house again. There were 100 reasons to say no. He said, What time? Walter smiled, the full version this time, the one that used his whole face. 7, he said. I'll have coffee ready. Much. Ethan drove the rest of the way home, with the radio still off. But the silence felt different than it had an hour ago. Less like absence, more like space. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a minute. The lights were on inside. Through the kitchen window, he could see Noah at the table, probably doing homework with the television on in the background, in violation of the rules they'd both agreed to, but which Ethan enforced inconsistently, and they both knew it. He'd learned that there were rules worth holding the line on, and rules that just weren't worth the fight. The homework with TV rule had migrated into the second category sometime around month 6. He climbed out of the truck. Inside, Noah looked up from a worksheet about fractions and said with the casual directness of an 8-year-old who hadn't yet learned to package his observations, "You look different." Ethan hung his keys on the hook by the door. "Different how?" Noah studied him. "Less tired." Ethan raised his eyebrows. "I'm exactly as tired as I always am." "You don't look it," Noah said, and went back to his fractions. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway, less tired. He tried to figure out what had shifted in the past 90 minutes and couldn't isolate it exactly, whether it was the physical work or the conversation or just the small specific experience of doing something for someone else without any thought of reward or recognition or how it would look. He'd just seen a man about to hurt himself and he'd stopped. And somehow in stopping, he felt slightly less stuck than he had this morning. He made dinner, pasta and the jarred marinara sauce that Noah vastly preferred to the homemade version, which Ethan had eventually stopped being offended by. He set the table. They ate. Noah told him about a disagreement at recess that involved someone named Tyler, who apparently had deeply controversial opinions about which Pokemon were the strongest, and Ethan listened with the full attention he always gave Noah's problems, regardless of scale, because he'd decided early on that a father who only showed up for the big things was going to miss the small things, and the small things were how kids learned whether they could trust you for the big ones. After dishes, after bath, after the extended negotiation over exactly how many pages of reading constituted enough reading before bed. Ethan sat in the hallway outside Noah's room until he heard his son's breathing even out. Then he went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and looked out the dark window at the backyard. When's the last time something surprised you? He thought about Walter's hands. The shaking. The way the man had looked at that farmhouse like it owed him a debt that only its restoration could repay. The voice going soft over the carpenter's tools. She always wanted to restore it. He thought about what it meant to carry someone's dream forward after they were gone. He was still standing at the sink 20 minutes later when his phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. Tennessee area code. He picked it up. The text read, "This is Walter Bennett. I got your number from the shop listing on Route 41. I wanted to make sure Saturday still works. Also, my daughter is visiting this weekend. Fair warning, she'll probably try to convince me I shouldn't be doing any of this at all. Don't let her." Ethan stared at the message. Then he typed back, "Saturday works. 7 a.m. Coffee had better be good. 3 seconds later, it'll be adequate. I'm not trying to impress anyone." Ethan set the phone down. He was smiling. He noticed it because it happened without him planning it. Something small. Something that hadn't happened at the end of a Tuesday evening in a very long time. He didn't sleep easily that night. He almost never did. But somewhere around midnight, his mind had quieted enough that he caught himself thinking not about what he'd lost, which was where his mind usually went in the dark, but about Saturday morning. About the smell of old lumber. About the particular satisfaction of fixing something broken with your own hands. About a 72-year-old man who had decided after one conversation on a gravel shoulder that Ethan Walker was worth keeping track of. He didn't know why that mattered as much as it did. He just knew that it did. And somewhere under 3 years of survival mode living, something that had been very quiet for a very long time had shifted just slightly. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the direction of hope. The faint, dangerous feeling that something might still surprise him. Walter, Ethan would later learn, had not texted that number simply to confirm a Saturday. He had texted it because he had already decided with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent 72 years learning how to read the material in front of him, that Ethan Walker was the kind of man worth building something around. And Walter Bennett had never in his entire life built anything carelessly. Saturday arrived the way good things sometimes do, quietly, without announcement slipping in before Ethan had time to second-guess himself. He was up at 6. Noah was up at 6:15, which almost never happened on a weekend, which told Ethan that Noah had been more interested in this than he'd let on. The boy came into the kitchen, already dressed, jeans, his favorite worn-out Titan sweatshirt, and the boots he only wore when he wanted to feel serious about something. "You're up early," Ethan said. "So are you," Noah said. "I'm always up early." "I wanted to be ready," Noah said simply, pulling himself onto the bar stool and reaching for the cereal box with the focused efficiency of a child who had things to do. Ethan looked at him. "You don't know what you're getting ready for." "A farm?" Noah said. "Old guy. Fix stuff." He poured his cereal. "Sounds good." It did sound good. That was the part Ethan hadn't fully admitted to himself yet, that he'd thought about Saturday more than once since Tuesday. Not obsessively. Not with the buzzing anxiety he sometimes felt when he had something coming up he was nervous about. Just a low, steady pull. Like something he actually wanted, which was different enough from his regular life that he'd noticed it. He'd told Marcus about it at work Thursday, and Marcus had stared at him for a full 3 seconds before saying, "You made a friend, an actual human friend, who you're going to see again on purpose. It's not, he just needs help with a property." "Ethan." Marcus had pointed at him with a socket wrench. "The last time you voluntarily spent time with another adult human being for non-work reasons was the Hendersons' 4th of July party 2 years ago, and you left after 40 minutes because you said the potato salad smelled off." The potato salad did smell off. "I ate 3 helpings. It was fine." Marcus shook his head. Go help the old man. This is good." Ethan had waved him off, but the words had stuck. He loaded Noah and a bag with water bottles and work gloves into the truck at 6:45, and they were pulling down Millbrook Pike by 5 after 7. The farmhouse came into view, and even from the driveway, Ethan could see that Walter had been up well before either of them. The front porch door was open. There were 2 sawhorses set up on the side yard, and the smell of coffee reached him before he'd even cut the engine. Noah's head came up like a dog who'd caught a scent. "I smell breakfast," he said. "It's just coffee." "There's something else." Noah was already unclipping his seatbelt. Walter appeared in the doorway before they'd crossed the yard. He was wearing a canvas work jacket and carrying 2 mugs, and when he saw Noah, he stopped and looked at the boy with an expression that was surprised and genuinely pleased in equal parts. "Well," he said, "I wasn't expecting the whole crew." "This is Noah," Ethan said. Noah looked up at Walter with the frank, unembarrassed directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious. "My dad said you have a really old truck." Walter blinked. Then he laughed the same short, rough, surprised laugh Ethan had gotten out of him Tuesday. "I do have a really old truck. You want to see it?" "Yeah," Noah said immediately. Walter handed Ethan one of the mugs, jerked his head toward the side yard. "C10's around back. Come on." They followed him, and Ethan wrapped both hands around the mug and took a sip and stopped walking. "That's good coffee," he said. Walter didn't turn around. "I told you it'd be adequate." "You undersold it." "I undersell everything. Ask my daughter." Ethan almost let that go. Then he remembered the text. "She here this weekend. Getting in around 10, Walter said. He stopped beside the old Chevy and crouched down to Noah's level with the careful, deliberate movement of a man whose knees had opinions about crouching. 1973, he said to Noah. "I've had it since it was 4 years old. What do you think?" Noah walked around it slowly, genuinely studying it the way kids do when they're actually interested rather than performing interest. He stopped at the front, looked at the grill, then back at Walter. "It needs a lot of work," he said. Walter burst out laughing. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Noah. No, he's right, Walter said, still laughing. It needs a lot of work. I respect the honesty. He stood back up, joints protesting audibly. Come inside. I made eggs. They ate at the kitchen table eggs and toast and the kind of simple, unself-conscious meal that meant someone was feeding you because they wanted to, not because they were performing hospitality. Walter asked Noah about school with the patient, genuine attention of a man who had learned that children know instantly when you're pretending to listen and never forgive you for it. Noah told him about the Pokemon debate at recess. Walter listened to the whole thing seriously. Then he said, In my experience, the people who argue loudest about which things are strongest usually don't know much about actual strength. Noah considered this. That's pretty smart. I'm old, Walter said. I should be smart by now. It would be embarrassing if I wasn't. Ethan sat at that table and watched his son laugh at something a 72-year-old man said, and felt something move in his chest that was complicated enough that he didn't try to name it. He just felt it. Then he heard tires on the gravel driveway. Walter glanced at the window. That's early, he said, and his voice had shifted, not nervous exactly, but alert. Like a man bracing for something he loves that also reliably challenges him. A car door, footsteps on gravel, the screen door, and then a woman walked into that kitchen with the kind of energy that announces itself before the person, does not loud, not aggressive, just present in a way that takes up space without apologizing for it. She was somewhere in her early 30s. Dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it in the car without a mirror. Work clothes, but the kind of work clothes that said, environmental engineer not construction, because there was a quality to them that was professional, even when casual. Her eyes went to her father first, then to Ethan, then to Noah, and Ethan watched her do the mental math in real time. Who are these people? Why are they in my father's kitchen? What has he done? And watched her arrive at a conclusion that made her jaw do something very subtle and very controlled. Dad, she said, you said you'd have some help this weekend. I do have help, Walter said, gesturing broadly at Ethan and Noah as though the situation explained itself. You didn't say it was... She stopped. She looked at Ethan. She switched gears visibly the way a person does when they realize they're about to be rude in front of a child. Hi, she said, and her voice was polite, professionally polite. The tone of a woman who was very good at professional courtesy and was deploying it right now as a containment strategy. I'm Claire, his daughter, Ethan Walker. He stood out of reflex, which he immediately felt was too formal for a farmhouse kitchen, but it was already done. This is my son Noah. Hi, Noah said. Claire looked at Noah, and the professional politeness cracked just slightly, just for a second, into something warmer. Hi, how old are you? 8. How old are you? Noah, Ethan said. It's okay, Claire said, and this time when she smiled, it was a real one, brief and unguarded. 32. My dad's 35, Noah offered. Ethan looked at the ceiling. Walter across the table was examining his coffee mug with the intense focus of a man who was absolutely certain that if he looked up, he would ruin something. Claire pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down, and the kitchen rearranged itself around her presence, the way rooms do when someone walks in who is used to being competent. Walter poured her coffee without being asked. She wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at Ethan directly. My father didn't mention he was recruiting. He mentioned he needed a second opinion on the subflooring, Ethan said, and a strong back for a Saturday. He has subflooring opinions, she said, about which I strongly disagree. I think the East Wing should come down entirely and be rebuilt. I think that's premature before you see what's actually load-bearing, Ethan said. She looked at him more carefully. What's your background? She said. Mechanic, but I've done enough construction to know the difference between rot and damage. And you looked at the subflooring? Not yet. That's today. She turned to her father. You didn't even show him the subflooring before you... She stopped herself, breathed through her nose. Okay, fine, Show me. After breakfast, Walter said firmly. Nobody goes under the east wing floor before they've eaten. That's not a rule. It is now. I made it. Eat the eggs. Claire looked at Ethan across the table with an expression that said very clearly, he does this. Ethan looked back with an expression that he hoped communicated, I've known him 4 days, but yes, I'm beginning to understand. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not yet. More like a mutual assessment. Two people taking each other's measure across a kitchen table. She looked away first. She picked up her fork. Nobody said anything for 30 seconds. Then Noah said, The eggs are really good, by the way. Mr. Walter, did you make them? I did, Walter said. You should make them every Saturday, Noah said. Walter looked at Ethan over the boy's head. Ethan said nothing. Walter smiled at his coffee. The East Wing subflooring was, as Ethan had suspected, a more complicated situation than a simple replacement. He found the access panel in a back closet, dropped down underneath with a flashlight, and spent 15 minutes doing what his hands and eyes told him, before he came back up and gave his actual assessment. Claire was standing at the closet doorway, arms crossed. Not impatiently, she was a woman who thought with her body positioned like that, contained and ready. Well, she said, the rot is localized to about a 12-foot section along the north wall, he said. The rest is solid, older, but solid. You pull the whole east wing and you lose original material you can't get back. You address the 12 feet and reinforce the adjacent joists, and you've got another 40 years. She was quiet. You're sure about the adjacent joists? Come look, he said, and moved aside so she could get to the access panel. She looked at him for a beat. Then she crouched down without hesitation and dropped under the floor. Walter, standing in the hallway, caught Ethan's eye. He said nothing, but his expression said everything. Claire came back up 4 minutes later. There was dust on her sleeve, and she was brushing it off, and her mouth was doing something complicated, the specific expression of a person who has just had their position updated by evidence and isn't completely happy about it, but is too intellectually honest to pretend otherwise. The joists adjacent to the north section need sistering, she said. Agreed. And there's a moisture issue in the corner that needs to be addressed before any of this. Also agreed. She looked at him. You found the moisture issue in 15 minutes. It was obvious once you knew where to look. I've had 2 contractors look at this space. Neither of them mentioned moisture. Ethan shrugged. They were probably giving you a quote on replacement rather than looking at what was actually there. Her arms crossed again, but differently this time. Not containing herself, thinking. Processing. He'd seen that distinction more than once in his years dealing with customers who came into the shop having already been sold something they didn't need. What would you do first? She said. Address the moisture source. Find where it's coming from. My guess is the kitchen plumbing. Above there's a seam in the subflooring right under where the sink would be. Then dry it out. Treat it, sister. The joists replace the 12 feet, in that order. That's 3 separate phases. It is. That takes time. Good restoration always does. She looked at him sharply, like he'd said something that meant more than it appeared to. He hadn't meant it that way. He'd meant it about the house. But he watched the words land, and didn't take them back. Walter came in from the hallway with 3 bottles of water, and the general air of a man who had nothing to add to this conversation and was very much enjoying not adding it. They worked through the morning. It wasn't a graceful collaboration. Claire had opinions, and she stated them with the confidence of someone who was professionally trained in structural systems and knew it. Ethan had opinions too, and stated them with the confidence of someone who had been fixing things with his hands his entire adult life and knew when theory met reality and what happened next. They disagreed twice about the order of operations on the porch railing. Both times, one of them changed position partway through, and neither of them made it awkward. Noah spent the morning following Walter with a devotion that was completely unprompted, and that Walter received with quiet, dignified pleasure. The boy asked questions about the tools, about the wood, about how you knew if a wall was going to hold before you touched it. And Walter answered each one straight without condescension, treating Noah's curiosity like it was worth the respect of a real answer. At one point, Ethan was on the porch, working on a railing post, and he looked up and saw Walter teaching Noah how to use a hand plane on a scrapboard. Not simplified, not pretend. Actually showing him the angle and the pressure and what to listen for. Noah's tongue was between his teeth with concentration, and Walter's hand was over his, and they were working the plane together, and the curl of wood coming off that board caught the morning light. Ethan stood there with a railing post in his hand and didn't move for a moment. He didn't notice Claire had come up beside him until she spoke. "Your son asked him if he could learn something real," she said quietly. About 3 minutes after they went in there. "He said, I'm quoting Mr. Walter, I want to learn something real, not kid stuff." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "That sounds like him." "My dad lit up," she said. "I haven't seen him light up like that since—" She stopped. "In a while." The pause where she stopped was the kind of pause that meant since my mother died, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it because it didn't need to be said. "Noah needs that too," Ethan said. "He's got me, but I'm not—" He searched. "I can teach him mechanics. I can teach him how to be responsible and show up and do the work. But I can't teach him everything, and there's stuff a kid just needs from—" He stopped himself. "From older people," Claire said carefully. "From a grandfather," he said. And then immediately regretted the word, not because it was wrong, but because it was too much, too fast, too true. He looked at her sideways. She was looking at the workshop window, at her father and his son. "He never had grandchildren," she said. "I don't have kids. My brother's in Oregon and his kids are still small." She paused. "He doesn't say it bothers him, but it does. I can tell. He's the kind of man who," she searched for the word, "accumulates people, collects them. He's always been the person everyone else comes to." She looked at her water bottle. "Losing my mom hit him harder than he shows." "Most men don't show it," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I didn't for a long time," he said. "After my wife, I was so busy holding everything together for Noah that I didn't let myself feel it until it came out sideways, late at night mostly, or when a song came on the radio." He paused. "Or when Noah would do something she would have loved, and I didn't have anyone to say look to." The word look hung in the air between them. Claire was very still. "That's exactly it," she said softly. "That's exactly what it is." Ethan looked at her. "You felt that after my mom?" She nodded once. "Something would happen that she would have had words for, and I'd pick up my phone to call her, and then—" She made a small gesture with her hand. "And it wasn't even the grief of the moment. It was the grief of all the future moments. Everything she was going to miss. Everything I was going to miss not having her for." They were quiet. From inside the workshop came the sound of Walter saying something to Noah and Noah's high, clear laugh in response. "He's good with him," Claire said. "He's good with everyone from what I can tell," Ethan said. "I've known him 4 days, and I feel like—" He stopped. "Like you've always known him," she said. "Yeah, he does that. I've watched him do it my entire life. He sees something in a person almost immediately, and he just goes toward it. He saw me on the side of the road struggling with a crate." "He wasn't struggling," she said, and she turned to look at Ethan directly for the first time in a while. "Or he was. But that's not why you stopped, is it? You stopped before you knew he was struggling." Ethan thought about it. She was right, actually. He'd seen the old man and the weight and the truck, and he'd just pulled over, before the hands started shaking, before any of it. "I don't know why I stopped," he admitted. "I do," she said. Then she seemed to hear herself and looked away. "I mean people like that who do, that it's usually—" She stopped, rerouted. "It's just not nothing. That's all I'm saying." She walked back toward the porch. Ethan watched her go. Something was happening that he hadn't given himself permission to acknowledge yet. But it was happening. Lunch happened at noon. Walter produced sandwiches from somewhere, and they ate on the tailgate of the old C-10, all 4 of them sitting in a row, which seemed both ridiculous and completely natural. Noah ate half a sandwich and immediately demanded to know if there was more, which Walter had anticipated and prepared for. Claire caught Ethan's eye across the top of Noah's head and smiled, not the professional smile from this morning, not the careful, contained smile from the kitchen. A real one. Brief, unguarded, gone before she seemed to realize it had arrived. Ethan looked at his sandwich. In the afternoon, they worked on the porch railing. This time they did it together without the disagreements which Ethan found more interesting than the disagreements they'd found a rhythm, the way two people do sometimes when they're built to work alongside each other when their instincts happen to be compatible. She held, he fit. He measured, she marked. Nobody had to tell anyone which way to move. Noah had gone quiet by 2 o'clock, the particular quiet of a child who is crashing slowly after a morning of intensity. And at some point, Ethan looked around and found him sitting against the farmhouse wall in a square of afternoon sun, with Walter next to him, not doing anything, just sitting. Walter was talking low and steady, and Noah had that heavy-lidded look that meant he was fighting sleep and losing. Ethan went still. He hadn't seen Noah do that with anyone, not since his mother. The child had built walls, small ones, age-appropriate ones, but walls around that particular vulnerability. Falling asleep next to someone, trusting someone's presence enough to let his guard down that completely. Ethan's throat went tight. Claire appeared at his elbow. "Don't," she said quietly. He looked at her. "If you cry, he'll wake up," she said, and her voice was very dry and very gentle at the same time. Ethan laughed a short, surprised sound and pressed his knuckle to his mouth to stop it. Claire put her hand briefly on his arm. Just for a second. Barely. Then she walked away to get the railing boards. Ethan stood there and felt the weight of the day on him. Not the bad weight, not the exhausted survival mode weight, but the weight of something real. Something that mattered. And then Walter from across the yard, without looking up, said, "You know, Ethan, a man's life doesn't run out of room just because he thinks it has." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sun had moved 3/4 across the sky before anyone suggested stopping. They'd done the railing, addressed the moisture identification under the east wing, cleared the back porch of 20 years of accumulated storage, and started preliminary measurements on the kitchen windows. More than Ethan had expected. More than any of them had planned. When he finally loaded Noah into the truck, the boy, barely conscious, held together by stubbornness and the residual excitement of the day, Walter stood on the porch and raised a hand. "Same time next week," he said. Ethan buckled Noah in. "Yeah," he said. "Same time." He was about to climb in when he heard her voice behind him. "Ethan." He turned. Claire was standing at the edge of the porch, and she had the look of someone who had decided to say something and was going ahead with it before she thought better of it. "I'm in Nashville during the week," she said. "But I'm back Saturdays." She paused. "I thought you should know. Since you're here, Saturdays." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said what that meant. Neither of them had to. "Good to know," he said. He climbed into the truck. He didn't turn the radio on driving home, but this time the silence wasn't empty. It was full of the smell of old lumber and good coffee, and the sound of Noah asking Walter a question, and Walter answering it straight. Full of a real smile on a woman's face that she'd tried to take back before he noticed. Full of his son asleep in the passenger seat, more relaxed than Ethan had seen him in months. The life he'd been surviving had, just without asking permission, without announcing itself, started to feel like something else. He didn't name it. Not yet. But he drove home with both hands on the wheel and his jaw unclenched for the first time in 3 years, and the road ahead of him didn't look like the same road it had been this morning. Something had shifted, and somewhere in that farmhouse he already knew, without knowing how he knew it, that Walter Bennett had planned exactly this. Every single bit of it. 3 Saturdays passed before Ethan admitted to himself that he was counting down to them. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way he announced to anyone. Just the quiet, private fact that by Wednesday of each week he was already thinking about Saturday morning. Already thinking about the smell of Walter's coffee and the sound of Noah's voice getting louder and more comfortable in that farmhouse kitchen. Already thinking about Claire. He didn't examine that last part too closely. He just let it be there. Marcus noticed on a Thursday morning in late October, which was 4 weeks after the first Saturday, which meant 4 Saturdays had now happened, and Ethan had said almost nothing about any of them to anyone except Noah, who had opinions about each one, ranked primarily by whether Walter had made eggs. "You're humming," Marcus said from underneath a Silverado. "I'm not humming." "You were absolutely humming. I've worked with you for 6 years. You have never once hummed." "People hum, Marcus." "You don't. You're a non-hummer. It's one of your defining characteristics." Marcus rolled out from under the truck and looked at Ethan directly. "Is this about the farm?" "It's about nothing." "Is it about the daughter?" Ethan picked up a wrench he didn't need. Marcus pointed at him. "It's about the daughter. I need to finish the brake job on the Tahoe. Ethan, talk to me. I have ears. I am standing right here." Ethan set the wrench down, looked at Marcus, made the calculation of how much honesty was worth the conversation that would follow. "We talk," he said. "When she's there on Saturdays. We talk while we work. It's nothing." "What do you talk about?" "Everything." He paused. "Work. Noah. The house. Her job. She's an environmental engineer. She does watershed remediation projects. It's actually—" He caught Marcus's expression. "It's interesting," he said more carefully. "You find environmental engineering interesting." "I find her interesting. The engineering is part of it." Marcus was quiet for 3 full seconds, which for Marcus was extraordinary restraint. "Ethan Walker," he said. "Are you—" "Don't. Are you falling?" "Marcus, I swear." "I'm just going to say it's good, that's all. I'm just going to say it's good, and then I'll stop." He held up both hands. "It's good. You deserve good things. That's it. That's the whole speech." Ethan picked the wrench back up, but he didn't put it down for a second to deal with the feeling that had just moved through his chest, which was something between embarrassment and gratitude, and a third thing he still wasn't naming. That Saturday, the 5th one, he arrived at the farmhouse at 7:05, and Claire's car was already in the driveway. He sat in his truck for a moment longer than necessary. Noah looked at him. "You okay?" "Fine," Ethan said. "You're doing the thing where you grip the steering wheel." Ethan looked at his hands. He was in fact gripping the steering wheel. "Let's go," he said and climbed out. Inside, Claire and Walter were in what appeared to be a full-scale disagreement about the kitchen window frames. Not an angry one. The Bennett family seemed to conduct their disagreements at room temperature, with the precision of people who had long ago accepted that they were both stubborn and had learned to work around it. Claire was standing with both hands flat on the kitchen table over a set of drawings she'd made. Walter was standing with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who respected his daughter's drawings while having no intention of being governed by them. They both looked up when Ethan and Noah came in. "Good morning," Claire said, and it was Ethan noticed different from the first Saturday. Warmer, more immediate, like she'd been waiting to say it. "Tell him," Walter said to Ethan by way of greeting, pointing at the drawings. "Tell him what you told me last week about the original window casings. I said they were worth preserving if they're structurally sound." Ethan said carefully, looking at both of them, and deciding this was a minefield he was entering sideways. "Structurally sound," Walter repeated, vindicated. "I wasn't arguing they weren't sound," Claire said. "I was arguing that the style doesn't match what I found in the original property photographs." She pushed a photograph across the table toward Ethan. "Look." He looked. Then he looked at the window frames. "She's right about the style," he said. Walter blinked. "But you're right that they're structurally sound," Ethan said to Walter. "Which means you could keep the frames and replace the trim profile. Best of both." There was a beat of silence. "That's actually the right answer," Claire said slowly. "I know," Ethan said. Walter looked between them. Then he sat down, picked up his coffee, and said to Noah, "You want to learn to read a set of architectural drawings?" Is it hard? Noah said. For most people, Walter said. You'll probably get it in an afternoon. Noah sat down immediately. Claire looked at Ethan. He looked back. The kitchen felt very small suddenly. Coffee's on the counter, she said. Thanks, he said. They stood there for 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned back to the drawings, and he went to get his coffee, and nothing happened technically. Nothing at all. But something had moved between them again, the same wordless current that had been running on a low frequency since that first Saturday, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. By mid-morning, they were working on the kitchen window frames together, and this was how their working relationship had evolved over the past month. Less friction. Same honesty. But the friction had become something more like contact. Like the way two people who fit together move when they've stopped overthinking the fit. You measured that wrong, she said. I measured it correctly. You wrote it down wrong. I have a master's degree in engineering, and I have 11 years of making things fit that people measured wrong. Check the mark. She checked the mark. Okay, she said. The second number on the left. I see it. 1/16 off. You're very annoying, she said, but there was no heat in it. Yes, 1/16. That's the difference between a frame that fits and a frame that sticks every time it rains. I know what 1/16 means. Then we agree. She handed him the corrected measurement with more force than necessary. He took it straight-faced. From the other room, Walter's voice rose with some story he was telling Noah about a house he'd built in 1987 that had a client who changed his mind 17 times about the staircase, and Noah was laughing in the specific way he did when something delighted him open-mouthed and unself-conscious. Claire turned her head toward the sound. He tells that staircase story to everyone, she said. He's been telling it since I was 10. Does it get better? It gets longer, she said. And better. Every year there's a new detail. I think he's forgotten which parts are true and which parts he added. My grandfather was like that, Ethan said. He hadn't talked about his grandfather in years. He didn't know why he said it. Every story was true, but the version he told in 2005 was not the version he told in 1995. What happened to him? He passed when I was 22. He paused. He was the person I called when things were hard. Before my wife. After him, she was the person. He set his pencil down and looked at his hands. I don't have a person like that anymore. Someone who just knows, without a lot of explanation. The room was quiet. I think you might be getting one, Claire said carefully. He looked at her. She was looking at the window frame, but she wasn't looking at the window frame. My dad doesn't do this, she said. Invite people in, put them to work, make eggs. He doesn't do it randomly. She paused. He did it with my mother, 38 years ago. She was the daughter of a man whose car he was fixing. He convinced the father to let him take the car back for a road test that took 3 hours and covered 60 miles, and he came back with my mother's phone number. She turned to look at Ethan. He picks people, Ethan. He decides. And he doesn't decide wrong. The weight of what she was saying sat in the air between them. Ethan held it carefully. What about you? He said quietly. She blinked. Does he decide for you? Ethan said. Or do you decide for yourself? She looked at him straight on. I decide for myself, she said. Always. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Neither of them moved. Then Walter appeared in the doorway. Window frames, he said, looking at them both with an expression of supreme neutrality. How are they coming? We need to run a new measurement, Claire said, and turned back to the frame. Right, Walter said, and looked at Ethan for exactly 1 second, with an expression that was not neutral at all, and then went back down the hallway. The afternoon moved fast. It always did at the farmhouse. Time had a different quality there, less like something being used up, and more like something expanding. They finished the kitchen window frame measurements, did a full inspection of the west bedroom ceiling, where a water stain from a leak that had been fixed years ago suggested there might be structural involvement, and found that there wasn't just cosmetic, just paint easy. Small victories on a restoration project were worth celebrating because they meant the bones were good and the bones of this house were good. At one point in the early afternoon, Ethan was in the hallway on a ladder looking at the ceiling joists, and Claire was handing tools up from below, and Noah came around the corner at a run and stopped when he saw them. "Dad," he said. "Yeah." "Walter says lunch is ready, and if you're not at the table in 5 minutes, it gets cold and it's your own fault. Tell him we'll be right there." Noah looked at Claire. "He made grilled cheese," he said with the gravity of someone delivering genuinely important news. "I know," Claire said. "He makes it with sourdough and sharp cheddar and puts a little mustard inside." Noah's eyes went wide. "The mustard is the secret part I didn't know about." "It is," she said. "Don't tell anyone." "I'm telling everyone," Noah said, and ran back toward the kitchen. Claire looked up at Ethan on the ladder. He looked down at her, and that was all. That was the whole moment. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and they were both almost smiling, and Noah's footsteps were still audible down the hallway. But something in it, the smallness of it, the complete ordinariness of it, the way it felt both like the first time and like something that had been happening for years, landed in Ethan's chest and didn't move. He came down the ladder. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They went to lunch. It was at lunch that Walter told the story. He wasn't supposed to tell it, or rather, there was no occasion for it, except that Walter had decided it was time, which Ethan was beginning to understand was the only occasion Walter ever needed for anything. He'd just finished his second half of grilled cheese and set down his plate and looked at Ethan with the direct, unhurried gaze of a man about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. "You know," he said, "I saw you before Tuesday." Ethan looked up. "Before the truck," Walter said. "I saw you before that." The kitchen went very still. Claire had set her glass down. "What do you mean?" Ethan said. Walter folded his hands on the table. "About 2.5 years ago. The IGA on Sutherland. You were with your boy. He was small, smaller than now. 6 maybe. And you were—" He paused, choosing carefully. Having a hard moment. Ethan felt something cold move through him. He knew exactly which moment Walter was talking about. He'd hoped nobody had seen it. "The cereal aisle," Walter said quietly. Ethan said nothing. Claire looked at her father. "I was in the aisle behind you," Walter said. "I came around the corner with my cart, and I saw you. You were standing in front of the cereal section with your boy holding your hand, and you weren't crying. I want to be clear about that. You weren't falling apart. You were just—" He stopped. "You were looking at the cereal box, and there was something on your face that I recognized because I've had it on my own face." He looked at Ethan straight. "Your boy looked up at you and said, 'Dad, it's okay if you're sad. Mom would want us to keep going.' And you crouched down right there in the cereal aisle and you held him for a long time. And he let you." The room was completely silent. Noah had gone still, in the way children do when they understand that the adults around them are somewhere deep. Ethan looked at the table. He remembered that day. He remembered every single detail of that day because it had been one of the worst days in the first year, 6 months out, which people didn't tell you was often harder than the immediate aftermath. He remembered that he'd needed to buy cereal, and the brand his wife always bought had been rearranged on the shelf, and he'd stood there staring at it for too long, and then Noah had looked up at him. He'd thought no one had seen. "I pushed my cart right back the way I came," Walter said. "I gave you your privacy, but I never forgot it." He paused. "Because I've never seen a man choose his child over his own grief that fast. You put him first before you even knew you were doing it." He looked at Ethan. "That's who you are. That's not something you decide. It's just who you are." Ethan pressed his thumbnail into the table edge. He didn't trust his voice. Claire was looking at him, and then looking at her hands, and then looking at her father. "Dad," she said softly. "I'm telling him because he should know," Walter said. "And because you should know too." He looked at his daughter with eyes that were old and clear, and full of the particular love of a parent who has watched their child build walls and understands why and wants better for them anyway. He didn't stop on Tuesday because of how he looked or what he could get. He stopped because that's what he does. That's what he always does. The table held all of it, all the weight of it. Noah, who had been listening with the quiet intensity he deployed when he understood something was important, reached across the table and put his hand over Ethan's. Ethan looked at his son. 8 years old, dinosaur socks. Still the reason he stood up every morning. He put his other hand over Noah's and held on for a second. Then he looked at Walter. "Why didn't you say anything that day?" "Because you weren't in a place to hear it," Walter said simply. "People have to be ready." He picked up his glass. "And you had to find your own way back first." He took a sip. The conversation moved on the way. Good hard conversations do, when the people having them are too solid to let it swamp the room. Noah started talking about something that happened at soccer practice that week. Walter asked questions. Claire refilled glasses. But something had reorganized itself in the room, the way furniture looks different after you've moved even one piece, everything in the same place. But the whole arrangement changed. That afternoon around 3 o'clock, Ethan was in the backyard stacking salvaged lumber, and Claire came out and sat on the back porch step and just watched him for a moment. He worked for a minute before he said, "You can say it." "Say what?" she said. "Whatever you've been deciding whether to say since lunch." She was quiet. He kept stacking. "I had a relationship end 2 years ago," she said finally. "Someone I was with for 3 years. We were—" She paused. "I thought we were heading somewhere, and then I found out I wasn't the only one he was heading somewhere with." She said it flat and straight, the way people say things they've made peace with on the surface and are still working on underneath. "I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you because I want you to understand why She stopped. "Why I'm careful." Ethan set a board down, turned to look at her. "I don't need explanations," he said. "I know, I'm not explaining. She looked at her hands. "I'm choosing to tell you. There's a difference." He held that distinction. "Okay," he said. "I'm also telling you because—" She looked up at him. "Because you're the first person I've wanted to tell it to, and I don't know what to do with that information." The afternoon light had gone sideways and golden, and it was catching the side of her face, and Ethan made himself look at the lumber pile. "I don't either," he said honestly. She laughed, short, surprised, real. "Okay," she said. "We could just—" He searched. "Not do anything with it, for now. Just let it exist." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "I can do that." "So can I," he said. He picked up another board. She stayed on the step, and somehow the not doing anything felt like exactly the right thing, like they were both holding something fragile and had agreed without negotiating it to hold it steady and not rush. At 4:30, Walter came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw them. Ethan working, Claire sitting, and Ethan watched the old man register the scene and do absolutely nothing to acknowledge it, which meant he was registering it completely. "I'm going to need your opinion on the East Porch support posts tomorrow," Walter said to Ethan, as though this were a natural extension of something they'd been discussing. "I can come by Sunday," Ethan said. "Good," Walter said. He went back inside. Claire looked at Ethan. "You know what he just did?" she said. "He asked me about porch posts," Ethan said. "He has never in his life cared about porch posts on a Sunday," she said. "He cares about them on weekdays when he's bored. He structured a reason for you to come back tomorrow. Maybe he really needs the opinion." "Ethan." He set the board down. "I know what he did. And—" He picked up another board. "And I'll be here Sunday at 8. The smile that moved across Claire's face was not the professional one and not the careful one. It was the one he'd been seeing in glimpses for 5 weeks. The real one, the unguarded one, the one she didn't seem to know she was making. She stood up from the step, brushed off the back of her jeans. "I'll be here too," she said. "Coincidentally." "Right," he said. "Coincidentally." She went back inside. Ethan stood in the yard with a salvaged board in his hands, and the afternoon going gold around him, and something moving through his chest that was too big to look at directly. He thought about the cereal aisle. He thought about Walter pushing his cart back the way he came and giving a stranger his privacy, and then carrying that stranger in his memory for 2.5 years until the right moment arrived. He thought about what it meant to be seen, not performed for, not evaluated, just seen in your worst moment, in your most honest moment, and found worth something. He'd spent 3 years feeling invisible in the specific way that functioning people become invisible. The grief that doesn't stop your life becomes the grief nobody checks on. The dad who keeps the lights on, and the lunches made and the school runs happening becomes the man nobody worries about. He had survived so effectively that the surviving had made him disappear. Walter Bennett had been watching for 2.5 years, waiting for the right moment. And 2 weeks ago, on a gravel shoulder on Millbrook Pike, he had pulled a crate toward the edge of a truck and let it tip just far enough. Ethan thought about that. He set the board down very carefully. He thought about a 72-year-old retired carpenter who had lost his wife of 40 years and decided in his grief that the best use of his time was to go find someone else's person for them. He went inside. Walter was at the kitchen table, going over drawings. Ethan sat down across from him. Walter looked up. "The crate," Ethan said. Walter's expression didn't change. "On Tuesday," Ethan said, "when I pulled over. Was it actually tipping?" Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very calmly, "The crate was perfectly stable." Ethan stared at him. "I may have adjusted my grip at the right moment to create a certain impression," Walter said. "The truck is 30 years old, not my knees. I can load it myself. I've been loading it myself since before you were born." The kitchen was absolutely silent. "You staged it," Ethan said. "I created an opportunity," Walter said precisely. "For what?" Walter set his pencil down, folded his hands, looked at Ethan with those clear, direct eyes that had been reading people for 72 years. "Margaret told me something the week before she passed," he said. "She said, 'Walter, when I'm gone, don't you sit in that house and wait to die. You go find the people who need finding, and you put them together, and you stay busy.'" He paused. "I've been busy." Ethan sat across the table from this man, this deliberate, impossible, extraordinary man, and didn't say anything for a long moment. "What if I hadn't stopped?" he said finally. Walter picked his pencil back up. "You would have stopped," he said simply. "That's not something I was worried about." He went back to his drawings. Ethan sat there, and somewhere down the hallway, he could hear Claire's voice and Noah's voice tangled together in some exchange that ended with both of them laughing. He sat with that sound and let it fill the room. He sat with the fact that he had been found. Not by accident, not by luck. By an old man with carpenter's hands and 40 years of loving one woman and enough faith in people to go looking for the right ones on purpose. He sat with it. And slowly, for the first time in 3 years, the weight he'd been carrying began to feel not lighter. It wasn't lighter, it would never be lighter, but held by more hands. And that made all the difference. The Sunday after Walter admitted he'd staged the whole crate moment, Ethan arrived at the farmhouse at 8 o'clock sharp with 2 cups of gas station coffee, because he'd left too early to make his own, and the specific feeling of a man who had spent Saturday night processing something large, and had arrived at a place not of resolution, but of acceptance, which he was finding was usually the honest version of resolution anyway. Walter was already on the porch. He took one of the coffees, looked at the logo on the cup, and said nothing, which was Walter's version of gratitude. Claire's car was in the driveway. Ethan had known it would be. He'd known since she said coincidentally. She was in the kitchen when he came inside, standing at the counter with her own coffee and a yellow legal pad full of notes, and she looked up when he walked in and said, "I've been thinking about the east porch supports." "Good morning," he said. She almost smiled. "Good morning. I've been thinking about the east porch supports. What about them? I think we've been approaching it wrong. We keep talking about replacing them, but if you look at the original construction. She turned the legal pad toward him. She'd sketched a diagram. A real one, precise and dimensioned, the kind of drawing that came from someone who did this professionally. The original posts were hewn timber, not milled. My dad thinks they were cut from trees on this property in 1959. If even 2 of the 4 are still structurally viable, we can sister them and match the profile on the replacements, and the whole porch reads as original. Ethan looked at the drawing, looked at her. "When did you do this?" he said. "Last night." He looked back at the drawing. "This is good." "I know," she said, and there was no arrogance in it, just fact. "The question is whether the posts are viable, which requires you to go look, because I trust your read on timber condition more than mine." He looked at her. She looked back at him evenly. "That's the first time you've said that," he said. "Said what?" "That you trust my read on something more than yours." She considered that for a moment. "It's the first time it's been true about a specific thing." He laughed. She laughed. It happened at the same time, and surprised them both, and the kitchen felt like the kind of room where something good was being built. Walter appeared in the doorway from the hallway. He looked at them. He said, "I'll go check on the posts," and went back down the hallway before either of them could respond. Claire looked at Ethan. "He's not going to check on the posts," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "He's going to sit on the side porch and drink his coffee and wait an appropriate amount of time." "I know." She put her legal pad down. She looked at her coffee mug. She was doing the thing he'd learned to recognize the internal negotiation, the deciding the moment before she said something true. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Okay. And I want you to just hear it. You don't have to respond. You don't have to say anything back." "Okay," he said again. She looked at him directly. "I had my walls up so high the first day I walked into this kitchen and saw you sitting there that I couldn't even see you clearly. I just saw a situation I didn't control, and a person my father had decided to insert into my life, and I was angry before I knew your name." She paused. "And then you went under the floor and came back up and told me the truth about the joists instead of telling me what you thought I wanted to hear. And then you worked next to me all day without once trying to impress me. And I went home that Saturday, and I couldn't stop thinking about that." She looked at her mug. "About what it meant that you didn't try." He waited. "That's it," she said. "That's what I wanted to say." He nodded once. They stood in the kitchen with that between them. Then he said, "I noticed you on the first day too." She looked up. "But what I actually noticed," he said, "was how you looked at your father. The way you came in, braced for a fight, and then in the same breath went completely soft when he handed you coffee without being asked." He paused. "That told me everything. About who you were when you weren't protecting yourself." Her jaw moved slightly. He picked up his gas station coffee. "Now let's go look at the porch posts before Walter develops an elaborate reason to not come back." She laughed again, and this time it lasted. This time it filled the kitchen and picked up her legal pad. 2 of the 4 posts were viable. He knew it the moment he ran his hand along the wood, feeling for the compression resistance that told you whether the fiber had integrity or whether it had given way to years of moisture and gravity. He tested each one the way Walter had probably tested them 30 years ago, palms flat, listening through his hands, reading what the material told him. Claire stood beside him at each post. She didn't second-guess him. She took notes. It was a different kind of intimacy than Ethan had expected to feel, the kind that came from working alongside someone who respected your knowledge while holding their own, who knew when to speak and when to watch, and could tell the difference. "These 2 are good," he said on the 3rd post. "This one," he moved to the 4th, tested it. His hands told him something his head didn't want to hear. "This one's gone." 3 out of 4, she said. 3 out of 4 isn't bad." "No," she said. "It's actually better than I expected." Walter, who had appeared on the porch behind them, without either of them noticing, because apparently the man moved like smoke when he chose to said, "I knew those two were good. I grew up leaning against them." He tapped the nearest viable post with one thick finger. "My father put these in. Black locust. Hardest wood in Tennessee. He said they'd outlast everything." He paused. He wasn't wrong about much. Noah was there that Sunday too, arriving with Ethan's neighbor, who had driven him over because Ethan had told him where they were going, and Noah had said with the absolute certainty of a child who had made a decision, "I'm going too." He came in, found Walter in the back room, going through a box of his father's old blueprints, and sat down next to him without asking if it was okay, which it entirely was. Ethan could hear them through the wall. Walter explaining what each blueprint symbol meant. Noah asking questions that were smarter than they should have been for an 8-year-old, but which Ethan had stopped being surprised by, because Noah was his mother's child in his brain, and his father's child in his hands, and the combination was formidable. At one point, Claire stopped in the doorway to the back room and just watched them. Ethan stopped behind her. They watched Walter point to a section of blueprint, and Noah lean in brow, furrowed tracking it. "My dad never had a grandson," Claire said quietly. "I know," Ethan said. "Noah calls him Mr. Walter." "I know. He's going to be wrecked when—" She stopped herself. "When what?" Ethan said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were careful. "When the restoration is finished, when there's no reason for you to keep coming back every weekend." He held her gaze. "Who said the restoration is going to finish?" he said. She searched his face. "Walter told me he has a barn out back," Ethan said. "And the barn needs a new roof. And after that, the fence line along the north property needs replacing. And he mentioned something about a root cellar door." She was very still. "Projects like this," Ethan said, "tend to expand if the people working on them want them to." The question in that sentence was clear. Her answer was not immediate. It wasn't impulsive. It was Claire, which meant she took 3 full seconds to decide, and when she decided it was all the way. "I'd want them to," she said. He nodded. She nodded. They went back to the porch posts. 3 weeks moved through November, like pages turning each Saturday, and most Sundays the 4 of them falling into a rhythm that felt less constructed and more grown, like something that had rooted and was finding its own shape. Walter and Noah. Ethan and Claire. And all 4 of them together around a table at noon with food that Walter made and conversation that covered everything from Noah's soccer bracket predictions to Claire's watershed project in Robertson County, to Walter's increasingly elaborate stories about houses he'd built and the people who'd lived in them. Ethan watched himself become, without deciding, to someone who laughed on weekends. He noticed it the way you notice weather changing, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of them. He noticed it when Marcus said on a Tuesday, "You look different this week, less like you're carrying a refrigerator." He noticed it when Noah, getting ready for bed one Thursday, said, "Dad, are we going to the farmhouse forever?" And Ethan had said, "I think so, Bud," without hesitating. He noticed it when he woke up on a Saturday morning, and his first thought was not survival, not the list of tasks and responsibilities and things to hold together, but the simple, warm, uncomplicated thought of today. But then, November produced a Wednesday that rearranged everything. He was under a Dodge Ram at the shop at 2 in the afternoon when his phone went off twice in rapid succession. He ignored the first one. The second one he reached up for because something about the pattern, the 2 in a row without a pause, felt different. Claire. The first text said, "Call me when you can." The second one said, "Actually call me now." He was out from under the truck before he'd consciously decided to move. He called. She picked up on the second ring, and her voice was the voice of a person who was holding themselves together with deliberate effort, which he recognized because he had lived in that voice for a year. "They offered me the position," she said. He knew which position. She'd mentioned it 3 weeks ago briefly, the way you mention something you're hoping will go away, a regional director role with a watershed conservation organization based out of Asheville, North Carolina. A role she'd been quietly in the running for since summer. A role that was by any objective measure Exactly what her career had been building toward for 8 years. Asheville was 4.5 hours from Millbrook Pike. When, he said. They need an answer by Friday. He sat down on a stack of tire boxes in the supply room because his legs had made a decision independent of the rest of him. Congratulations, he said. The word cost him something. She heard what it cost. Ethan. No, he said. I mean it. That's real. That's what you've worked for. I know what it is, she said, and her voice was tight. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. 3 seconds. 4. What do you want to do? He said. I don't know, she said. And the fact that Claire Bennett, who always knew, who always had the answer ready before the question finished being asked, said she didn't know, hit him harder than almost anything. Okay, he said. I need to think. Okay. I'm going to come to the farmhouse this weekend, and I'm going to talk to my dad. Okay, he said for the 3rd time because it was the only word he had that was honest, and not asking for more than she was ready to give. She hung up. He sat in the supply room for 4 minutes. Then Marcus pushed the door open, took one look at him and said, What happened? Job offer, Ethan said. For Claire, Asheville. Marcus sat down on the other tire box. They sat there together. Is it a good offer? Marcus said finally. Career defining, Ethan said. Oh, Marcus said. Yeah, Ethan said. Friday came. She texted him, asked for until Monday. They gave it. Sunday came. He drove to the farmhouse with Noah and the gas station coffees, and the feeling of a man walking into a room where something important was about to happen that he had no control over. Claire and Walter were already at the kitchen table when he arrived. He knew from the quality of the silence that they'd been talking. Walter looked at him when he came in, and then looked at his coffee and said to Noah, I've got something to show you in the workshop. And they were gone in 30 seconds, which was Walter clearing the room with the efficiency of a man who had been reading situations for 72 years. Claire had her hands around her mug. Ethan sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He'd learned that was what she needed first, the space before the words. He cried, she said. He waited. My dad, last night. I told him about the offer and he... She stopped. He doesn't cry. He has cried maybe 4 times in my life that I've seen. He cried when his father died, and he cried at my mom's funeral, and he cried when I graduated, and that's the whole list. Her voice was controlled, but only just. He cried last night, and then he wiped his face and he said, Claire, if you don't take that job because of me, I will never forgive myself. And if you do take it because it's right, I'll be proud of you every single day. Ethan's throat tightened. She looked at him. And then he said... She stopped. Her voice broke somewhere in the middle of the sentence, and she brought it back. He said, Some things that matter don't have to be close to be real. The kitchen held both of them in it. What do you want, Claire? Ethan said quietly. Not what's right. Not what makes sense. What do you want? She looked at him with eyes that were full but not spilling. I want both, she said. And I'm furious that I have to choose. Maybe you don't, he said. She looked at him sharply. Asheville is 4.5 hours, he said. I've driven further for less important things. He paused. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's not impossible. You'd do that, she said. I'd do that, he said. If you wanted me to? You have Noah. You have the shop. Noah has school Monday through Friday. I have every weekend unless there's an emergency. He held her gaze. I'm telling you the facts. I'm not telling you what to decide. She looked at the table. Something was moving behind her eyes. The calculation, the feeling, the 2 things she usually kept separated, working on the same problem simultaneously. What if it doesn't work? She said. What if it does? He said. She looked up at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. I'm scared, she said. I know, he said. I haven't let myself want something like this in 2 years. And now there's this job, and there's... She stopped. There's this, he said, meaning everything. The farmhouse, the Saturdays, the legal pads and the window frames, and the post measurements and the lunches, and the moment she'd stayed on the step while he stacked lumber. There's this, she said. From the workshop came the sound of something being hammered. Noah, probably under Walter's direction, learning something real. Claire put her hands flat on the table. I'm going to take the job, she said. It landed in the room. Ethan breathed through it. Good, he said. Don't say good if you don't mean it. I mean it, he said. And he did mean it, which was the complicated thing. He meant it, and it hurt at the same time, and both of those things were true simultaneously. I mean it because that's what love looks like. Not holding someone back from the thing they were built for. She went very still. Neither of them had used that word before. He heard himself use it. He didn't take it back. She looked at him across the table with something open and unguarded on her face that she hadn't shown him before, not in 5 Saturdays of real conversation. Not in the afternoon on the step, not in the kitchen that morning. She'd told him about the man who had broken her trust. Ethan, she said. Yeah, he said. I need you to understand something. She leaned forward slightly. I've been managing distance my whole adult life. Distance is where I'm comfortable. It's where I know how to function. She paused. If I do this, if I take this job, and we do whatever this is, I'm not managing distance this time. I'm not protecting myself with geography. He understood what she was saying. She was saying, if I go, I'm not running. If I go, I'm choosing the job and also choosing this. If I go, you're not what I'm leaving. He understood it completely. I know the difference, he said. She exhaled. One long, slow, genuine exhale, the kind that came from a body releasing something it had been holding for a long time. And then Noah burst through the back door at full speed with sawdust on his sweatshirt, and his eyes lit up from whatever Walter had just taught him, and he stopped when he registered the room and looked between his father and Claire with the intuitive accuracy of a child who felt things before he understood them. Is everything okay? Noah said. Ethan looked at his son. He looked at Claire. Yeah, bud, he said. Everything's okay. Noah studied them both for 3 more seconds with the exhaustive seriousness of a child running a diagnostic. Then something satisfied clicked behind his eyes. Walter says lunch is almost ready and he wants everyone at the table, Noah said. Tell him 5 minutes, Ethan said. Noah pointed at both of them. He said, don't let them say 5 minutes, say now. Claire laughed full and real and the kind that takes the whole room with it. Ethan stood, held his hand out across the table, not as a gesture toward anything. Just his hand, open, offered. She looked at it for 1 second. Then she put her hand in his. They walked to the kitchen. What happened the following Monday restructured everything again. Claire called him at 7 p.m. He was making dinner pasta, the jarred marinara, Noah already at the table doing homework. He stepped into the hallway. I talked to the hiring manager today, she said. And I told them I'd accept on one condition. He waited. I told them I'd been consulting on a restoration project here in Sumner County and that I had professional reasons to be back in Tennessee at minimum twice a month. I asked if the position could be structured with a remote component. What did they say? They said... She paused, and in the pause he could hear the shape of the answer. They said the position was designed with some flexibility because the director travels to project sites regularly anyway, and that twice-monthly Tennessee presence was entirely workable. He stood in his hallway. He didn't say anything. Ethan, I'm here. I'm not compromising the job, she said. This is a real arrangement. The work needs it anyway, it's not invented. Another pause. But I wanted you to know. I wanted you to know I asked. He put his back against the hallway wall. He thought about the cereal aisle. About a man with his son's hand in his, crouching down on a grocery store floor because that was the only way he knew to hold on that day. About Walter pushing his cart back and giving him privacy, and carrying that moment forward for 2.5 years. He thought about the crate on the truck bed, about a 72-year-old man with carpenter's hands who had looked at a broken person and seen something worth building around. He thought about Claire Bennett walking into that kitchen with her professional walls up and her legal pad and her 1/16th correction, and slowly over 5 Saturdays setting all of it down. He thought about Noah saying in the car on the first Saturday, "You look less tired." "Claire," he said. "Yeah. Come back this weekend." A beat. "I'm already planning to," she said. "Good." He went back to the kitchen, set his phone on the counter, stirred the pasta. Noah looked up from his homework. "Who was that, Claire?" Noah went back to his homework. 3 seconds later, without looking up, "Is she coming Saturday?" "Yeah," Ethan said. Noah nodded satisfied and circled something on his worksheet. Ethan stood at the stove and felt the night settle around him differently than it had been settling for 3 years. Still quiet. Still just the two of them. But the quiet had texture now, not empty, not the silence of absence, but the silence of enough. Enough to stand on. Enough to build from. He thought about what Walter had said on that first afternoon on the gravel shoulder, before he'd understood any of what was coming. Sometimes needing help doesn't mean you're weak, it just means you're human. He'd said it to Walter, but he was only now understanding that Walter had been waiting for him to say it to himself. He stirred the pasta. He called Noah to the table. The night moved on, and 4.5 hours away, in a Nashville apartment, a woman with a yellow legal pad was writing something down that had nothing to do with window frames or watershed remediation or porch post measurements. She was writing something down that she would carry with her to Asheville and back twice a month on a road that ran straight through the county, where an old farmhouse sat with its lights on and its bones repaired and its kitchen smelling like coffee and wood shavings. And something that had no name yet, but was getting closer to one every week. Claire left for Asheville on a Tuesday in early December with 2 suitcases, a carload of boxes, and a yellow legal pad that had moved from watershed calculations to something more personal somewhere around the 3rd week of November. She did not cry at the farmhouse when she said goodbye. She was not the kind of person who cried at departures. She had told Ethan this herself, matter-of-factly, the Sunday before she left while they were resealing the kitchen windows together. She had said, "I don't cry at goodbyes. I cry later alone in my car, where nobody has to witness it, and I don't have to manage anyone else's reaction to it." He had said, "That sounds efficient." She had thrown a paint rag at him. But she had also, before she climbed into her car, that Tuesday morning, walked back to where Ethan was standing on the porch and stood in front of him and put both hands flat against his chest. Not a hug, not yet something more deliberate than that, and looked at him straight and said, "I'll be back in 12 days. "I know," he said. 12 days is not a long time. "I know that too." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she dropped her hands, walked to her car, got in, and drove down Millbrook Pike without looking back. Walter stood next to Ethan on the porch. They watched the car until it turned at the end of the road. Walter said, "She looked back." Ethan turned to look at him. She didn't look back. "In the rear view," Walter said. "Right at the curve." He took a sip of his coffee. "I was watching." He went inside. Ethan stood on the porch alone. He looked at the curve in the road where her car had gone. He put his hands in his pockets. 12 days felt entirely manageable from the outside. It was 11 days from the inside that got complicated, because on day 11, Noah came home from school with a fever of 102, and Ethan spent the next 48 hours in the compressed single-track urgency of a sick child situation. School absence calls and children's Tylenol and the specific alertness of a single parent at 2 in the morning with a thermometer in his hand, doing the math on whether the number on it required the emergency room or another hour of watching. It didn't require the ER. The fever broke Thursday night. By Friday morning, Noah was pale but functional and demanding specific soup, which Ethan made from scratch, because it was the one thing his wife had taught him to do in the kitchen that he was genuinely good at, and which Noah claimed tasted different from the canned version, even when Ethan had once run an experiment with the canned version in a bowl, and Noah had called it immediately, with a certainty that was both annoying and impressive. He texted Claire on Thursday night, "Noah's sick. Fever's down. We're okay." She called in 40 seconds. Not a text back. A call. "How high?" was the first thing she said. "Peaked at 1024, coming down." "How long has he had it?" "Since yesterday afternoon." "Have you slept?" He looked at the clock. 2:47 a.m. "Some." "Ethan?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He leaned back against the headboard and closed his eyes for a second. "I'm tired. He's going to be okay. It's just, you know how it is. The 3 a.m. math." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing. "I know the 3 a.m. math," she said softly. "I've done it for my dad twice since his heart thing last year. You're sitting there running the numbers, and you don't trust any of them." "Exactly." "You call me if the number goes back up," she said. "I don't care what time it is." He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. "Claire," he said. "Yeah?" "You're 4.5 hours away." "I know where I am, Ethan. I said call me." He didn't argue. He said okay. "Okay," she said. "Get some sleep. What's left of it." She hung up. He set the phone on the nightstand and lay there in the dark and felt something settle through him that was not the exhaustion lifting. It didn't lift. He was still running on 3 hours and anxiety. But something underneath the exhaustion, some layer beneath the tired that was warm. The specific warmth of not being alone at 3 in the morning. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He didn't forget it again. Claire came back on a Saturday, 11 days after she left because she'd managed to compress her first week's work and driven back a day early without announcing it. She pulled into the farmhouse driveway at 9 in the morning, and Walter, who appeared to have been expecting her at exactly this time, despite no one having told him, simply opened the porch door and said, "Eggs are still warm." Noah, who had recovered fully by Thursday and was back to his normal velocity, was in the workshop with a set of hand tools and a piece of black locust Walter had given him to practice on. He heard the car and came out at a run and stopped when he saw Claire and said with the absolute directness that Ethan had stopped trying to manage, "You came back early." "I did," she said. "Why?" "Because I wanted to," she said. Noah considered this. "Okay," he said, and went back to the workshop. Claire looked at Ethan. Ethan shrugged. "He vets everyone. You passed." "I was apparently the only candidate." "Don't underestimate what it means that he went back to the workshop," Ethan said. "That means he's not worried about you anymore. He only watches people he's not sure about." She understood what that cost Noah, the watching. She'd seen it in the early weeks, the way the boy tracked her with those quiet, assessing eyes that were too old for his face, measuring whether she was safe to care about. She'd understood it immediately because she'd grown up watching her father do the same thing, and she'd inherited the instinct. She stepped up onto the porch. Ethan was standing in the doorway. They hadn't been in the same physical space for 11 days, and something about that registered in the air between them, not dramatically, not like a movie moment, but real, the way real things felt, direct and slightly nerve-wracking, and also completely right. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "How's Noah?" "Fully recovered. Back to having strong opinions about everything." "Good," she said. She walked past him into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway one more second. Then he followed her in. They worked that Saturday like the 11 days hadn't happened, and also like the distance had clarified something that proximity had been slowly building. Every exchange was slightly more direct. Every moment of working alongside each other had half a step less distance in it. When she handed him something he needed before he asked for it, he took it without surprise. When he caught her calculation error on the barn roof measurement, they'd started on the barn, just as Walter had planned. She corrected it without the pause she used, to take the pause that had been about deciding whether to trust his read. The pause was gone. It had been gone for a while. She'd just been keeping it as a habit. Habits were the last things to change. By noon, Walter had disappeared to the back of the property to walk the fence line he'd been claiming needed walking for 3 weeks, taking Noah with him, which left Ethan and Claire in the kitchen making lunch, which was the first time they'd been alone in the farmhouse kitchen without a project immediately in front of them, and nowhere to put their hands that wasn't each other. Claire was slicing bread. Ethan was at the counter. "How's Asheville?" he said. Honest answer or polished answer? Honest. She set the knife down. "It's good work. Real work. The project scope is exactly what I was told it would be, and the team is solid, and I think we're going to do something that matters for the watershed in 3 counties. She paused. "And the apartment is very quiet, and I don't know anyone there yet. And I've been working 12-hour days, partly because the work warrants it, and partly because stopping means being in the quiet." He looked at her. "I'm not complaining," she said. "I chose it." "I know you're not complaining," he said. "You never complain. It's one of your more frustrating qualities." She picked the knife back up. "I'm going to take that as a compliment." "It's both," he said. She cut the bread. He took a breath. "I want to say something," he said. She set the knife down again, turned to look at him. He'd been carrying this for 2 weeks. He'd practiced it at 2 in the morning when Noah's fever was coming down and he had nothing to do but think. He'd revised it on the drive to the shop and on the drive home, and somewhere around revision 11 he'd decided to stop revising and just say the true version. "I spent 3 years convinced that my life had a shape," he said. "That I'd found the shape of it with Sarah and Noah, and then Sarah died, and the shape broke, and I spent 3 years moving through the broken version of it, getting up, doing the work, taking care of Noah, and telling myself that was enough, because I didn't know how to want more than that without it feeling like a betrayal of what I'd lost." Claire was very still. "And then I stopped on a gravel shoulder for a man I didn't know," he said, "and discovered that what I'd been calling enough was actually just survival, and that survival is not the same thing as living." He paused. "I know what you're carrying from before. I know why you're careful. I'm not asking you not to be careful. I'm asking you to be careful with me specifically, because I'm not going anywhere. And I want you to know that in words, not just in showing up on Saturdays." The kitchen was absolutely silent. She looked at him with the open face, the one without the walls, the one he'd been seeing in pieces for 2 months and was now seeing all at once. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I drove back a day early," she said. He held that. "I told myself it was because the work allowed it," she said. That was true, but it wasn't the reason. She looked at him. "I drove back because I wanted to see you, and I was tired of pretending that was a secondary consideration." He took 1 step toward her. She didn't move back. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He reached out and put his hand along the side of her face, and she turned into it slightly. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way someone does when a touch is what they've been waiting for without realizing they were waiting. And they stood like that in Walter Bennett's kitchen, with the winter light coming through the window they'd resealed together, and the smell of coffee and sawdust in the air. He kissed her. She kissed him back. It was brief. It was real. It was the kind of first kiss that didn't feel like a beginning, because everything before it had already been the beginning, and this was just the moment they stopped pretending otherwise. When they stepped back, she was looking at him with the almost smile that had been turning into a real smile for 2 months. "About time," she said. "I was waiting for the right moment," he said. "You've had several right moments. I wanted to be sure." "Were you sure?" "I've been sure since you told me I measured the window frame wrong, and you were right." She laughed. He laughed. And it was the best kind of laughter, the kind that came from joy, that was real enough to be ridiculous. From outside came the sound of Walter's voice carrying across the yard, and Noah's voice answering, and the sound of their feet on the gravel coming back toward the house. They stepped apart. She picked up the bread knife. He went back to the counter. By the time Walter and Noah came through the door, the kitchen looked exactly as it had before, except that both of them were smiling in a way that they couldn't entirely account for, and Walter, who missed nothing, Missed nothing. He sat down at the table. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the two of them and said to no one in particular, "I think this bread needs butter." Noah looked at the bread. "It has butter." "More butter," Walter said serenely. He drank his coffee. The months that followed were not perfect. Ethan had not been under the impression they would be, and neither had Claire, which was one of the things that made them right for each other. Neither of them was naive enough to want perfect, and both of them were grounded enough to work with real. There were Saturdays when the drive felt long, and a Sunday when they had a disagreement about something that started with the barn roof and became about something else entirely, and which took 2 days of space and one very direct phone call to resolve. There were weeks when Claire's Asheville projects ran long, and the 12 days stretched to 17, and Ethan found himself in the 3 a.m. math again. Not about Noah's fever this time, but about his own patience. How long could you hold something at a distance before the holding cost more than the distance? He called Walter about that one. Not Claire. Walter. He called at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday and said, "How did you do it with Margaret?" when she was away and the distance felt like too much. Walter was quiet for a moment. "She was never away for long," he said. "We didn't do long distance." "Then why am I calling you?" "Because you need someone to tell you that what you're feeling is normal and that it passes," Walter said. "And because I'm the person who put you in this situation, and it's the least I can do." Ethan almost laughed. "It passes," Walter said. "And when she comes back, it's better than when she left. That's the arithmetic of missing someone. You only miss what's worth having." He hung up. Ethan went back to the pasta. Noah looked up from the table. "Was that Walter?" "Yeah. What did he say?" Ethan thought about it. "He said the arithmetic of missing someone only works if what you're missing is worth having." Noah thought about this with the focused consideration he gave to things that mattered. "That's pretty smart," he said. "He's old," Ethan said. "He should be smart by now." Noah grinned, the full-face eyes-crinkling grin that was his mother's grin that still caught Ethan in the chest sometimes, and that he was learning slowly to receive as a gift rather than a wound. The twist came on a Saturday in March. It came in the form of Walter sitting down at the kitchen table after lunch with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who has decided it is time and saying, "I need to tell you both something." Ethan and Claire looked at each other across the table. Then at Walter. "I've been to the doctor," Walter said. The room went cold. Claire's hand, which had been resting on the table near Ethan's, went still. "Dad," she said. Her voice was completely flat, the voice of a person who had braced before they'd fully heard it. "My heart," Walter said. "Not an emergency, but a conversation." He looked at them both. "They want to do a procedure, minor relatively, but they want to do it in the next 6 weeks, and they want me to have someone with me for the recovery." Silence. Noah had gone quiet in the corner of the room where he'd been drawing something with the instinct children had for the weight of adult conversations. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire said, and her voice had broken slightly on the last word, in a way she couldn't hold back. "I'm telling you now," Walter said. "Dad." "Claire." His voice was gentle, absolutely steady. "I'm not telling you to frighten you. I'm telling you because I need help, and I've spent my whole life doing things the hard way alone, and your mother spent 38 years trying to teach me that asking for help doesn't cost you anything you need." He looked at her. "So I'm asking." She pressed her mouth together. She nodded once. Then she looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. "I'm going to come back," she said. Not to him, to her father, but looking at Ethan. "I'm going to work it out with the director. I can do remote for 6 weeks. I'll come back for the procedure and the recovery." "You don't have to," Walter started. "I know I don't have to," she said, and her voice was entirely steady now. "That's not the point." Ethan put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held on. Walter looked at their joined hands. He looked at the table. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth. He was not a man who cried often. Ethan had learned that. But he had to tell those 2 fingers pressed briefly to his mouth before he recomposed, and Ethan had seen it exactly twice. Once when Noah had fallen asleep against him on the porch in October. And now. "Okay," Walter said. He dropped his hand, picked up his coffee. "Now, the barn roof measurements. I think we've been miscalculating the pitch." Noah looked up from his drawing. "Can I help with the barn roof?" "You're 8, Ethan said. "Almost 9, Noah said. "Walter says I have good instincts." "He does have good instincts," Walter said. Ethan looked at the ceiling. Claire squeezed his hand. Walter's procedure happened on a Wednesday in April. Minor as promised, a catheter ablation 4 hours outpatient. Claire sat in the waiting room for all 4 of those hours, and Ethan sat next to her for 3 of them because he'd dropped Noah at school and driven straight to the hospital and walked into the waiting room and sat down without asking whether he should be there because he knew the answer and Claire knew the answer. And neither of them needed to discuss it. At hour 3, when the waiting had gone from manageable to the specific grinding fluorescent light anxiety of medical waiting rooms, Claire said, "Tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this." He thought. "Noah asked me last week if he could call Walter Grandpa," he said. She turned to look at him. "He wanted to know if that was okay," Ethan said. He said he knew Walter wasn't actually his grandfather, but that he was starting to feel like one, and he wanted to know if he should call him something different, or if Grandpa was too much. "What did you say?" she said. "I said I'd ask." She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. "What do you think Walter would say?" "I think he'd pretend it was no big deal," Ethan said, and then go in the back room and press 2 fingers to his mouth. Claire made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else entirely, and put her face briefly in her hands. He put his arm around her. She leaned into it. They sat like that in the waiting room until the doctor came out and said the procedure had gone exactly as planned, and Walter was awake and asking if someone had thought to bring coffee. He recovered at the farmhouse. This was decided before he'd been discharged, and not by him. Claire had worked it out with her director 6 weeks remote, 2 of them fully on-site in Asheville by video, and she moved back into her old bedroom at the farmhouse without fanfare and without making it into a thing, because that was how she did things that mattered. Quietly. Fully. Without ceremony. The 6 weeks were the best 6 weeks the farmhouse had ever seen. That was not a sentimental assessment. It was a practical one. More work got done on the barn in those 6 weeks than in the previous 3 months. Partly because Claire was there every day, and partly because Walter bored, and on restricted activity, had opinions that he expressed continuously from a chair on the porch, directing the work with the authority of a man who was technically not supposed to be doing any of it. Noah came every Saturday. Sometimes Friday nights, sleeping in the small back room that had been cleaned out and quietly furnished at some point with a narrow bed and a lamp and a hook on the back of the door for his jacket, which Ethan noticed on the 3rd Friday night and said nothing about. He said nothing about it to Claire. She said nothing about it to him, but their eyes met across the hallway when Noah found the room, and what passed between them in that look was too large to put into words and didn't need to be. The Saturday that happened on the last weekend in May was when everything that had been building for 8 months came together, in the way that real things come together, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a moment so ordinary it would have been invisible to anyone not paying close enough attention. Walter was on the porch. Recovered, declared healthy by his cardiologist 2 weeks prior, back to carrying things he probably shouldn't be carrying, and being corrected about it by Claire, which was the natural order of their relationship, and which both of them preferred to the alternative. Noah was in the workshop. He had his own corner of it now. A small workbench that Walter had built to his height with a precision that suggested it had been planned long before it was presented as spontaneous. Ethan and Claire were in the kitchen. She was going back to Asheville on Monday, a real return this time, not a temporary one. Back to the project, back to the apartment, back to the rhythm they'd built over the winter of weekends and phone calls and the 12-day math and the fact that missing each other had become in its own complicated way one of the textures of something they'd chosen and kept choosing. She was at the counter. He was at the table. Neither of them was saying anything, which was its own kind of conversation. Then she turned around and looked at him and said, "I want to talk to you about something." He looked at her, put his coffee down. "I've been looking at the watershed project distribution," she said. "There's a significant component of it in the Cumberland River Basin," she paused, "which runs through Tennessee." He waited. "My director and I have been talking about restructuring the project regions. There's a legitimate case to be made for a Tennessee-based presence on the project. Real basis not invented." She was watching him. "It would mean a potential office in Nashville, and being here more than twice a month." The kitchen held its breath. "How much more?" he said carefully. "Most of the time," she said. "With Asheville twice a month instead of the reverse." He looked at her. She looked back. "Is that the project talking?" he said. "Or is it both?" she said. "It's always been both. That's the thing about finding work you love and a life you want. Eventually they stop being separate arguments." He stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her, and she lifted her face to look at him, and they were close enough that the conversation between them didn't need volume. "Claire," he said. "I know," she said. "I want you here," he said. "Not because it's convenient. Not because Noah loves your father and your father loves my son and the barn needs a roof. Because I want you here." She put one hand flat on his chest, right over where the words were. "I know," she said again, and this time it wasn't an interruption. It was an answer. He kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes for a second. From outside came Walter's voice calling to Noah about something involving the fence line, and Noah's voice answering with confidence, now the confidence of a boy who'd spent 8 months learning something real and knew it. They stepped apart. They looked at each other. Something had completed itself in the room. Not ended. Nothing important ends. It only becomes what it was always becoming. But completed. The shape they'd been building quietly without announcing it through gravel driveways and kitchen tables and legal pads and window frames and 3 a.m. phone calls and a waiting room in April, the shape had found itself. Claire went to the counter and picked up her coffee. Ethan went to the back door and called out, "Walter, lunch in 15. 20, Walter called back. 15, Ethan said. A pause. 17, Walter said. Noah's laugh rang out across the yard. Ethan came back inside. Claire was already getting plates out of the cabinet. The third shelf, the one she'd learned without anyone telling her, the one that had been that shelf since Walter's mother put the first dish in it in 1962. She set them on the table without looking, without thinking the way you do things in a place that has become yours, without the moment you decided it. Ethan set the glasses. She set the silverware. He folded the napkins, the way Walter liked them. Not fancy, just folded the way his father had folded them at every meal, which was a detail Ethan had noticed on the third Saturday, and remembered without trying. She noticed that he'd remembered. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. The back door opened, and Noah came in first. Face-flushed hands wiped on his jeans, the way Walter had taught him to do before coming to the table. He pulled out his chair, the left one which had become his chair months ago without any negotiation, and sat down and looked at the plates and said, "What are we having?" Walter came in behind him slower, deliberate moving with the care of a man who had been reminded recently that the machine needed maintenance, but who was absolutely not going to be precious about it. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Claire. He looked at Noah. He picked up his fork. "Pass the bread," he said. And just like that, without ceremony, without announcement, the meal began. The four of them around that table in the house that Walter's father had built in 1959, that Margaret had dreamed of restoring, that had sat empty and slowly forgetting itself until a man had stopped his truck on a gravel shoulder and reached out his hand to a stranger. The four of them passed bread and poured water and talked about the barn roof pitch, and Noah's soccer, and a watershed in 3 Tennessee counties, and a fence line that needed new posts. They talked about ordinary things, because they had built the kind of life where ordinary things were enough, where ordinary things were everything. Ethan looked across the table at his son, who was arguing cheerfully with Walter about whether the fence posts should be cedar or locust, and felt it not as an idea, not as something he had to remind himself of, but as a physical fact in his chest, as real as his heartbeat. He was not surviving anymore. He was living. And 3 years after standing on the edge of his bed in the dark and saying one name to remind himself to stand up, he had a table full of people who would have said it with him. That was not the end of the story. It was the thing the story had been building toward all along. Not a destination, but a foundation. Solid, real, load-bearing, the kind that lasts.